Well, a very warm welcome to this Ian Ramsey Center lecture, which is the final of this term. And we are pleased to have today the Professor Arthur Petersen, who is Professor of Science, Technology, and Public Policy at University College London, Chief Scientific Advisor to the Dutch Delta Commissioner, and Editor-in-Chief of Zygon, Journal of Religion and Science, of which many of you will be familiar. Arthur is going to speak from a recent book, and he's going to talk on the topic of poetics and climate, modern myth, and disenchantment. We'll have plenty of time at the end for questions. Arthur, over to you.
Thanks, Sean. So, well, it's really great today to be here, give a talk in Oxford. I realized it's nearly 10 years ago that I embarked on a part-time DPhil in this faculty on science and religion with Alistair McGrath as my supervisor. And other than by publishing the resulting open access, you can download it for free, book with UCL Press 1.5 years ago, I hadn't directly yet let my Oxford colleagues and friends know what I've been up to. So thanks for the opportunity now to make good on that, what I've been up to in the past decade. So I will therefore use this opportunity not only to lay out the argument of a pivotal chapter in my book, which has this title, Poetics and Climate, Modern Myth and Disenchantment, but I will also really set it in the context of my larger argument, which is on the question of the philosophical argument on naturalism, and I add a term there, transcendental naturalism, which I will also briefly explain. So we'll give some insight in my engagement then with science and religion, and specifically from my practice in my role at University College London, but also my role as an advisor to governments. I'm really interested in the science-policy interface and what science and religion can contribute to the science-policy interface. I find a really interesting niche where I have experience on the science-policy interface side, and I'm learning on the science and religion bit, not least also by being editor-in-chief of Zygon, which was so funny in a sense because I said to Alistair, do you mind, I was a DPhil student, that I become the editor-in-chief of the main journal in the field. And I had to deal with submissions of Alistair's which had to undergo major review. Okay. You all know Alistair. It worked out really well. I didn't know I would get it, but I did. So I really would like to highlight this kind of question of how to deal with naturalism in science and religion, but then also set in the context of climate change, and also adding to the mix the question of how to deal with the impacts of climate change in non-Western countries, where you also have to engage with and deal with non-Western worldviews. So there's a lot of stuff. I'll do it within the hour, so we will be able to have questions at 6 and then drinks. So I will explain, I would like to take you with me on this intellectual journey that I have been on, and I will briefly delve into each of the main philosophical points that I make in the book, and I have very simple chapter titles, the main titles. So I have an argument on wonder, an argument on judgment, on values, on models, on poetics, which is a kind of a crucial central chapter in the book, and then on authorities and futures. And besides Bruno Latour, who made it to the subtitle of the book, I have two main interlocutors who are William James, American philosopher, and Heinrich Rickert, a German philosopher, both turn of the 20th century. So that will all help in getting across what I want to say about poetics and climate, and I'm using this term poetics in the way that the Belgian scholar, who I will briefly introduce shortly, Ferdinand Hallin, has been using that term as encompassing but having a wider sense than poetry, and referring to the coming together and effects of textual elements. The specific question that I will discuss at the beginning and the end of my lecture is whether we can or should build modern myths using science, based on imagery from science, to then deal with what we often suppose has happened, the disenchantment of nature, in order then to solve the climate crisis. Now, that's a big question, and it has an even larger question lingering in the background of whether there actually is a hole, this disenchantment, that needs to be plugged. Instead, I think it's an important observation to start with, that some narratives of science are given a mythological status, and such a scientism will be a hindrance, is my claim, to addressing the climate crisis. So besides dealing with Latour, James and Rickert, who will follow later, the three books that are shown here feature centrally in my argument on poetics in science and religion. Those are books by the scholar already mentioned. That's Fernand Hallin. He worked in history, French literature, science technology studies, a whole range of disciplines he combined. The well-known here, Alistair McGrath, an old book of his, 2002, let's say from theology, and then Lisa Sideris, a book in religious studies. And also Latour himself addressed this supposed religious disenchantment of nature as a problem of modernity and a consequence, in a sense, of a scientism that he saw. All of these authors, each in a different way, they offer useful insights to reflect on this problem. And in terms of what science and religion might then mean in the context of the climate crisis, or even more broadly the ecological crisis, I have examined modern myth-making, including Latour's own ideas about what he calls creating a civic cult around, he calls it Gaia, a civic cult that will us societally address his idea of Gaia, and I will give some detail about that in this talk. So I conclude that you cannot build such a cult without poetics. But I also question how far you can come. It's an open question. And let me start now with the book on the left-hand side, because that was very much an eye-opener to me. This book, so Professor French, he worked at Ghent University. So Fernand Hallin, he has been, this book has been really inspiring to me, and it seemed to have made a little splash when it appeared, I have the impression, in the English version in 1990. But I have not seen, and I am surprised to not have seen, a level of long-term take-up that I would have expected. So I can really, I really hope this book gets rediscovered in a sense. The book is titled The Poetic Structure of the World, Copernicus and Kepler. And what it does is giving a very detailed analysis of the interlinkages between the scientific texts. So it's about poetics, it's really about their texts. The texts from Copernicus and Kepler, and the wider cultural matrix in which they lived. So for the Copernican revolution, Hallin analyzes how Copernicus made use of organicism, its demand for symmetry and formism, its preference for the circular form. And he also analyzes how Copernicus was tightly linked to the intertextual field of the Renaissance, and how he associated, for instance, the solar center with the conception of the divine. With regard to Kepler's poetics, Hallin shows how Kepler examined the poetic presuppositions of Copernicus and realized some new potentialities. So Kepler added harmonic requirements from music to the mix, bringing in the elliptical form. He followed mannerism of his time in further emphasizing the ellipse, and he built an aesthetics on the basis of a theory of ideas which resulted in his universe looking like what the Germans would call a Wunderkammer or a Kunstkammer. So he grafted a multiplicity of metaphors and models onto the global order. So for instance, Copernicus' theme of the solar center leads in Kepler to the allegory of center, radius and surface, which are important if you describe the ellipse, as a figure for the Trinity. And he's really serious about that. So Poetics, in these examples of 16th century science, but I would claim also more generally, they are allowing one to read meaning in the world. So let me connect Poetics to wonder and judgment under uncertainty, to cultural values, to models in scientific and religious practices, to a plurality of authorities and an openness of the future. So that's the whole argument of the book, including futures that involve non-modern worldviews. So here are the 7 philosophical claims in my book, and I will briefly sum up in this way the upshot of my approach, which I call transcendental naturalism, before I will delve more deeply into Latour's work on Gaia and climate change, and what I see as a need for new poetics. So here on wonder, the emotion of wonder facilitates a positive reading of uncertainty and intimations of metaphysical transcendence. So poetics are a response to this emotion of wonder. Then a second claim is that humans they retain aesthetically felt freedom in arriving at judgment. Uncertainty is attached to determining the a priori contribution to judgment. Without really explaining all the elements here, but I just want to give you the upshot and the summary. The important element here is that there is an aesthetically felt fit that you have reached the right judgment. So in science, it can be that you feel you have found the right theoretical composition. For instance, with the solar center, the sun in the middle. Or in religion, that you have found completely different practice with a very different value and goal. They have found the right prayer, the right song, to give some examples. And those can all be analyzed as involving poetics. So I really am stretching this notion of poetics here, but I think it can do work. Then values. The way I analyze values in the book is that they are part of nature, and some people find that controversial. I think it's straightforward, but hey, they're part of nature. They are assumed in judgments, and then uncertainty arises in the various cultural practices where these values are realized. They're realized through value-laden judgments that are made under freedom and in context. So there's again a lot packed in here. There's a whole chapter behind which I invite you to read. And I will discuss a little bit more deeply the kind of the underlying transcendental naturalistic approach inspired by Riekert after I went through Latour's Facing Gaia book. The issue here is that whether particular poetics work or don't work in a given cultural practice, that's determined using standards or values that are themselves subject to uncertain interpretation and evolve over time. So there's no way I'm saying there are kind of objective values that we can be certain about. I just want to be very clear about that, while at the same time I'm analyzing values as having their own ontological status, which I will get to. Then models. I have a whole chapter on models, and that's both about scientific models, religious models, and they should not be interpreted realistically. So I have a statement there about, for instance, scientific realism. The most that you could do, other than you can only do a realistic interpretation if you use a weak form of what I call referential realism. So there's no approximating the kind of underlying reality with your models, but what you do with your models does refer to something that exists in the world. And then experience, our experience features our perception, percepts that are subsequently referred to by concepts. So that's how I work out this referential realism, and you always have uncertainty remaining attached to the concept. So the whole approach, also in the title of the book, is called Climate, God and Uncertainty. So uncertainty is there everywhere, nearly every page. It's all about how we deal with that. We don't have conclusive judgments, but we do make judgments. We do have values, and we are proceeding in that way, and that's the way culture is made. So models themselves thrive on poetic expression, for instance using metaphors, and that works differently in science as compared with religion, and I do analyze that a little bit. So in science, models, they as they in any practice have to do, of course they appeal to the imagination, but they're really necessary for making progress in scientific research, even though they should not be taken literally, and they do not necessarily build on analogies with what we already know in daily life. Lots of models are very remote from daily life. While in religion, typically, if you have poetically expressed models, similarly appeal to the imagination. They're necessary for evoking religious responses, but they do build on communal religious experience, and actually they are both exploratory and affective. So that has a different role and a different way they're made, but still I think it's a useful thing to talk about models in these different practices, realizing that we're talking about different sorts of models with different purposes, and all involving some form of poetics. Poetics, as already said, they are available to us to read meaning, including religious meaning, in the world via judgment under uncertainty. So there's uncertainty again, and that's the beauty of poetics, that it can handle that uncertainty, can keep that openness. And then next one, before the last one, is about authority. So a plurality of cognitive authority should always be recognized in any practice. That's kind of my dogma. I never want to close a practice down, not in religion, not in science, right? So I'm always for maintaining a plurality. And then, for instance, in science, it means that if you arrive at an expert judgment, for instance, in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, I will say something about the IPCC as well, you have to always acknowledge that what you do is a value-laden exercise. So then the question arises how, for instance, scientists then reflect on different types of values, both epistemic and non-epistemic values, and the associated poetics in their so-called expert judgments when they provide science advice. And I am all for opening that up and not letting things be hidden under supposed authority. And finally, on futures, they must be kept open, is again one of my central conclusions under uncertainty. And I look at the specific example of clashes between modern planning and science on the one hand, and non-modern worldviews on the other hand. And I will give two examples at the end of the talk. And those two examples, one is called, it has a term called monkey cheeks. You won't really understand it until you see the video, but remember that term, monkey cheeks, which is denoting here is shorthand, the poetic expression for a Buddhist approach in Thailand for water management. And the other example is Mother Earth, probably more familiar, which I also could see as a poetic term, but it really denotes a comprehensive indigenous approach to what moderns would call ecosystem services management. And there's a big clash between those two ways to approach how we deal with the world. Whether you have a whole kind of indigenous approach, which is also codified in some laws in some Latin American countries related to Mother Earth, or whether you try to more instrumentalize that as a way to manage ecosystem services. So I will demonstrate how hard it is for modern science to engage diplomatically with and constructively also with these indigenous life worlds, and because the poetics also of these life worlds are just too different to really straightforwardly relate to. So Bruno Latour then. So though his initial work was on religion, he became famous for his approach to science studies, studying the laboratory as an anthropologist from the mid-70s. And it was brought together in 1987 in his book Science in Action. And in that work he further uncovered the networks that scientists and engineers build, especially also outside of their laboratory, and where Hallin's work, which I highlighted, focuses on poetics in science, and that then has to deal with the intangible elements in the context of discovery. In contrast to that, Latour emphasizes in his science studies work that focuses on stabilizing networks by enrolling tangible entities. So he has a different focus, and I hadn't realized that until I tried to look through a Latourian lens at the role of poetics in science. And yeah, then I really was confronted with the fact that he never agreed with using a distinction between a context of discovery, emphasizing context in that sense, and a context of justification, emphasizing content. So in Latour's view, the network linkages to cultural resources, such as texts, the poetics of science, which I find really important and interesting, he would say those are easier to destabilize compared to the tangible entities. And I think that Latour has missed a trick there, given how important non-tangibles can be for the analysis of scientific practice. I think it's part of an overreaction from his side against a reification of culture. So he's always fought against that, especially also against social scientific explanations using cultural categories. So his philosophical magnum opus, An Inquiry into Modes of Existence, that appeared in French in 2012 and in translation in English in 2013, constitutes his ontology, and I would say his philosophy of value. So I will spend more attention on his 2013 Gifford Lectures, later published as Facing Gaia, 8 lectures on the new climatic regimes. And nobody has really analyzed this as this is Gifford Lectures. This is about naturalism. That's not an engagement or from theology. There's very few people who have engaged with Latour, and also really analyzing it as this Facing Gaia as an important contribution to science and religion. So this book as a whole addresses another notion of nature, which he calls, and that's confusing in a sense because you really have to get into that kind of language, the figure of Gaia. And Gaia is not de-animated, not over-animated. It relates to what he is looking for. He wants to find a new civic cult, and I would say a new associated poetics for outlining planetary borders that societies would impose on themselves. Now, towards the end of his life, he became more and more active in terms of formulating what politics should be like in the climate crisis. I'm using the climate crisis term because we are used to doing that. He was very much against using the crisis term, so I have to highlight that too. And he thought it was an erroneous way to call the era we live in an ecological crisis. It suggests too much that it can be resolved. And as he highlights also in Facing Gaia, if only it were just a crisis. So let's deal with that. So let's get into the book, the Facing Gaia book. So it has 8 chapters. In the final chapter, he gets then to the new civic cult that he claims is needed to govern, and that we will have to draw for that on new poetics is my claim there. But let me briefly walk you through some highlights of this extremely rich book. So he introduces the need to naturalize, he uses that term too, differently from a scientistic way to naturalize. So he criticizes taking the nature versus culture split as a starting point, and he claims we should let go of the concept of nature with a capital N. He says, and also, in effect he says it's bad poetics, nature with a capital N. And he also tells off more politically climate scientists for having been too naive in their previous engagements with politics. So, and one of the things that they have been doing, and he criticizes them for that, is invoking scientific certainty. It doesn't really refer to how science actually works. Latour is the champion of analyzing the practices of science and how everything remains uncertainty, although some claims are stronger than others, and you need to really analyze how that works. But just saying follow the science to policy and politicians is not going to be effective. And it's also not poetically the right way to refer to how the earth or Gaia works. It's effectively an old, and he really literally makes that connection, an old theological model of God connected to certainty, which is then projected onto science and nature with a capital N, which result in this de-animation of nature. I think that's a capital mistake. And he analyzes then Gaia and the earth as having agency, having a history, and us thus needing a new language for celebrating that and for politically mobilizing action. So the concept that Latour then brings to bear in describing the situation that we find ourselves in, using this figure of Gaia that may confuse us, many readers. So he does take pains to explain that in his use of that concept of Gaia, he is referring to a secular concept that could assist us in learning to participate in the geohistory of the planet. And he still thinks that a form of naturalized worldly thinking remains crucial. And we can get rid of the scientistic naturalism without falling in the trap of supernaturalism. So he criticizes also the poetics of the globe, which he traces to derive from an original Platonic obsession, transferred into Christian theology and deposited in the political epistemology of the modern. So he really has a very deep analysis of how modern politics, how modern science has derived from a history of ideas in a sense. And he criticizes that and he opens it up. Also the Anthropocene is a term that's used, which he also sometimes uses. He also criticizes it. It's not doing the trick necessarily. The issue is with the anthropos. For instance, in anthropogenic climate change, there is very much politically a problem, which is who can claim to speak for the human in general, without arousing, that's a sentence in his book, 1,000 protests at once, or even more. I've recently been reading the 2018 book by Catherine Yusuf, which is titled "A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None," and I can really recommend us to really look at that in terms of who is affected and doesn't have a voice in what's happening there. And then many Western scientists naively then construing, or some of them naively construing, like, where can we identify the point that humans are influencing geology, and then how can we kind of solve that problem? And then you ignore too much of the things that happened and how difficult it is to politically speak universally for everyone. So in his 5th chapter, it's on how to convene the various people of nature. It's titled, Latour offers his analysis of the roles of what he would say call the old and new conceptions of science and religion in, well, let's use the term, in the Anthropocene, or in the face of Gaia. And these new images, they are, so these images here, his image of nature and his image of religion, he calls it counter-religion because he has another analysis there that there was the original religion, and then what we now look at as, for instance, our Christian religion is a counter-religion. But these views here are the views that he uncovers through doing his anthropological studies of how these practices really work. Well, those images are the ones that are needed to create, let's say, the new poetics. And I won't discuss all these images in detail, but some important terms are multiverse, what else did I pick? Local, controversial, interpreted, networks is a very important term, embodied is a very important term. It gives you a little bit of a flavor of the kind of way he's writing about science on the one hand, and religion on the other hand. Now, Latour is very much concerned with the poetics of religious language, and he wrote his doctoral thesis about that in the 1970s. It was only published last year. His thesis is now published in its entirety. And he wrote a whole book on religious speech in French, Jubilé, in 2002. So he has really done work on religion, and he is, of course, then focusing on what his preferred image of religion or counter-religion is, and that has a focus on the world, the earth, keeping an open attitude towards uncertainty about specifically the end times. He has very interesting analyses of the apocalypse and how things have gone wrong in many interpretations of religion, and how he wants to correct that, and how that will also help in dealing with the climate crisis. So facing Gaia has nothing to do with poetic imagery of a rural paradise, for instance. It's really future-oriented, and we must recognize, we must learn to recognize the territory to which we belong, and which we must represent in new forms of politics, developing a new civic cult with new poetics associated. And I have a picture here, which is also coming from the book. This is a really fascinating exercise that Latour has inspired to be done, which is also related to creating not only new politics, but also new language. This is a concrete example of such a cult of Gaia here taking shape. And what they did was, in the run-up to the Paris summit in 2015, the conference of the parties for the Paris Agreement under the UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, they organized a simulation. And in that simulation, instead of having only the countries as the one who are allowed to speak, he had the oceans and indigenous peoples having delegations being allowed to speak and negotiate the text of the treaty. Very interesting experiment, and it results in really different imagery and ways to talk about what is the problem and what are the solutions. Of course, the question about such creative exercises is whether, besides the political intervention of giving them such representation and then the possibility to find new poetic expressions and of wonder as well that can assist us to share the planet, to care about intrinsic value. I really am fascinated by this. And some readers of my book have thought I'm against metaphysics or I'm afraid of metaphysics, but in the end I want to create the appropriate room and space for metaphysics and poetics. And then of course the question is whether doing it in this way, in a cult around Gaia, is actually going to do it. Whether that will create this wide orientation to solving the ecological crisis. I still have my doubts about it. I think it's still too much coming in a sense from, it's not scientific, but it's still very much inspired by scientific approaches and scientific analysis. And I don't think Latour really could get away from that. So before giving some glimpse of the ecological crisis that we are faced with, I would like to further philosophically characterize the transcendental naturalism that I laid out earlier. And about naturalism, it's easier to give a negative than a positive definition of naturalism. And I guess it has been discussed in this room forever. But here's one from Owen Flanagan, which reads, "There exists a supernatural being." So this is a definition of supernaturalism, right? Which opposes this one. Supernaturalism. There exists a supernatural being or beings or powers outside the natural world. There's one. 2, this being or power has causal commerce with this world. And 3, the grounds for belief in both the supernatural being and its causal commerce cannot be seen, discovered, or inferred by way of any known and reliable epistemic methods. So many problems of modernity, such as the religious disenchantment of nature, they stem from scientistic versions of naturalism opposing that supernaturalist approach. But you don't have to become scientistic to become a naturalist. Latour didn't, and as I will also briefly show, James and Rickert didn't. So I will explain my approach in 5 steps. First, the 2 main elements of the approach, highlighting the contributions of James and Rickert, as well as Latour, and then state what religious outlooks in terms of their philosophies are compatible with transcendental naturalism. So first, so the naturalism of my approach brings with it respecting the methods and claims of science, but not in a scientistic manner. That's a very subtle difference, but it's important. And also the transcendentalism then of this approach is respecting what I would call the separate ontological status of values, but in a manner that connects, that does not connect certainty or metaphysical status to them. Then from James, his radical empiricism and pragmatism, I retain an emphasis on practices and on the fallibility of judgment. From Rickert, it's a neo-Kantian, but one of the most open neo-Kantians of one of the 2 schools of neo-Kantianism. I retain, he actually called his own approach also transcendental empiricism. I retain an emphasis on different types of values, which are realized, fallibly realized in cultures. And at the end of his 1921 book, he has this fold-out table which Heidegger made fun of in his lectures. Heidegger was a student of Rickert's, and like, oh, my master has really gone nuts by having this kind of table of the values of culture laid out across these as a philosophy of value. I find it really interesting. Also, yeah, you have to take it with many grains of salt. And he also said, you cannot really prove this, but yeah, still, this is my way to talk about culture. And if you go to Latour, I wanted to rub it into him, but just before that he died. Like, hey, you are doing exactly the same thing as this neo-Kantian is doing at the end of his book, because he also has a similar table at the end of his book of the modes of existence. But what Latour does is, which I call his approach, occasionalist empiricism. From that, I do retain his emphasis on the contingency of what values are realized and how they are realized in different cultures, but also that you can study that empirically. So I really like his approach of connecting philosophy with social science, with ethnographic observation. So he was participating in some ritual in church. He had a big issue there in terms of whether or not belonging to the Catholic Church or not, but he went to Mass every Sunday, and he wrote a whole book about it, how he struggled about that. But he also went to the Council of State to see, how does law work? How do legal means work? Really going there and looking at that. And of course, I explained to you at the start, in his terms of empirical work, he really opened up the laboratory through his laboratory life work. He has this table at the end of his 2012-2013 book with the main value domains that characterize a culture and that he calls modes of existence. Now, to conclude my philosophical position, I have this claim that the philosophy of transcendental naturalism is consistent with many different kind of philosophical expressions related to religious outlooks, either theistic, or atheistic, or agnostic. So a very broad church. I have been attacked by a theist that I would have been excluding him from my philosophy, and this was at a book panel at the AAR in San Diego in November. I'm still struggling, but trying to find a way to formulate a response that he has a fear of missing out in a sense of this, and he can join the club. But there are some things that I think philosophically you shouldn't say as a theist, but that's on the philosophy front. Yeah, so be my guest to do everything you want. So I'm just having a very small argument about what you can do philosophically, and some people take offense with that, which is fun. The climate change problem then. Of course, we have to discuss that. Let me describe it in a particular way, as a problem that involves all domains of culture. And I start with this picture of a cascade of components, where from the bottom you have the different societal developments that lead to these greenhouse gas emissions here, and then in the end at the top they then lead to differently distributed geographical impacts. And I will describe I use the table from Latour. I will pick 9 of them, 9 cultural value domains that have a bearing on how the uncertain futures of this problem of climate change will play out. And I will then zoom in on 2 of those domains, that of science, what he calls the mode of reference, and of engineering, that he calls the mode of technology. And of course, the point is that I want to make, and I will re-emphasize it, that language, poetics, matters in all these different cultural domains. Also, how we talk about climate change matters. And one of my messages today is that poetics that's based on just science and technology, which for climate change would be assessed by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, that will not do the trick. That will not be enough to motivate action, because it doesn't touch enough on all these different cultural domains. So, of course, we have to still take seriously what the scientists say. And we have to formulate, know what we do and do not know in terms of what Latour would call chains of reference. What our models can and cannot predict about future climate change, melting ice sheets, etc. So my job as the chief scientific advisor to the Dutch government's Delta Commissioner resolves largely around this cultural domain of science, but I see it as my duty to also advise on all the other domains that I will put on the screen to get a holistic view of the problem. So one of the things that I do emphasize is the importance of climate fiction. Finding language, including embedded in it, poetics, about living in the future of a changed climate. So we have even a climate fiction reading group during our working hours in the department at London, in UCL. We even include creative writing exercises on climate fiction in our new bachelor's degree on science and engineering for social change, just to show how important that element is. And metamorphosis, another category, domain of culture in this sense. Again, language matters if we are going to take on, for example, you could call it the consumerism spirits that we in the West are possessed by. You can use this language of the kind of the psychiatric, we really have a deep illness together, and then the logic would be that only the right poetics can shake us enough to undergo an individual and collective metamorphosis. The morality question, Latour connects it very much to economics. There are different ways to look at this morality part, but who can emit how much greenhouse gases? And who can bear how much of the consequences? That is really a powerful ingredient. Language and poetics concerning climate change has to deal with that. Getting people to vote for you to tackle climate change requires particular ways to stir the emotions of the people to vote for you to deal with climate change. I claim it's possible. Don't have much empirical proof at the moment in some countries, but it is possible. And we really have to keep open that option. Then this may sound dull, law and poetics, but to me, I can really see poetic language if I read the legal judgments, especially against the Dutch government, right? On why the Dutch government needs to do more to protect future generations. And there's a human rights link there. It's beautiful logic in terms of the way the legal argument runs to insist on protection from climate change. Organizing is an element, a sphere, a domain of culture that we need to organize the transition, for instance, organize our societies towards transformative change. And in one of my first degrees, I had a minor in philosophy of organization. And there was a very interesting book by Gareth Morgan titled Images of Organization. And there's so much there in terms of how we organize that uses poetic expression to get things done. That's really interesting and important, I think, to focus on and analyze. Then technologies, of course, I already mentioned, we have the science and engineering as being really crucial. Technologies will continue to be invented to tackle different aspects of this great challenge of climate change. I will review a few of them, but like for science, poetics do play a role in the inner practices of how engineers talk about their inventions and their machines. And then religion, how we relate to nature, what our deeper worldviews are, what language and poetics we use to express the mode of religion, as Latour called it. I analyze in the book that he misses one element of religion that I call the mode of mystics. He really doesn't have space for that, so that's another important element to add. But these questions of religion and climate change are really important, I think, to work through. So back to Latour and then on to the IPCC. So you can apply Latour's approach to science in action. You can apply that to present-day climate science and technology, and I think it's important. So there are lots of uncertainties about the future of the climate and ways to deal with climate change, and they're large and they're deep. Once every 7 years, the IPCC produces a thick assessment, 3 assessment volumes that summarize what we know and don't know about the relevant science engineering. There's a lot of science engineering that isn't ready, that isn't kind of ready-made science yet. It's to a large extent it's science in the making. And Latour himself has been using this case of climate science to open up the black box of science with a capital S. And he actually has been regarding the presence of climate skeptics as a blessing in disguise for science studies. Because what do they do? He's critical of their image of science. He's very critical of their image of science. But it helps him, and it should help us, to get a more accurate picture of how science is really done. And then you have to look at the risks and uncertainties in actual science and engineering practices. And then you can see that if you look at the practices of, for instance, the IPCC, where you have these scientist lead authors who represent the climate science, they have to agree with diplomats on the summaries of the science. And the diplomats represent the politics of their countries. And in the end, what the world wants is to have these kind of bricks here that are giving the image from science on what we know about the climate system. In a way, the old nature versus culture is represented there. So you have the scientists, and they have the access to nature. And then you have the politicians who have to kind of, respond to that in a sense. Well, what's actually happening in the practice of formulating these summaries is that these hybrid networks are producing these summaries and are producing the language and are producing the poetics and the imagery that's used in the IPCC report. So, in a sense, you could say there's science and action happening at first, and then you have this purification, as Latour would call it. You get some idea of ready-made science, these thick IPCC volumes, that happens then later. But as Latour says, this distinction between context and content can only be made after the fact. So I have done my own science in action and politics in action fieldwork in the 1990s and 2000s, and still ongoing, but I focused on tracing how computer simulation is used in science and climate science specifically, and in politics. Here's a supercomputer used at the time. So I had an initial degree, bachelor's master's degrees in physics and philosophy. And then philosophy was together with science studies. I moved on a first doctorate at Utrecht University on convection and chemistry in the atmospheric boundary layer, using a supercomputer, computer simulation, to understand the lower part of the atmosphere. Several figures from this PhD thesis went into the second one. You know, the third one. The third one was the one here in Oxford. But the second one, and there was also an edition published with an American publishers. Several figures from that first one, they feature in this one. You see another figure here featuring at the front, and I will get to that. And that is the final thesis. The figure you saw in the second PhD was what I studied in 2001 when I was allowed as an observer in the Dutch government delegation as a philosopher from a university. So I was allowed in to study the practice of how they discuss these computer model simulations and the uncertainties. And what you see here is the difference between using, so this is all using models, having models with humans and their effects, those largely the greenhouse gas emissions, or models without humans. And this is the icon typically shown to show humans are causing the climate change. There's a more subtle story behind because the models are also uncertain. But this is a really very important imagery to highlight that the warming is largely stemming from humans. And this shows the same findings in a different way. So we have seen a warming of 1 degree, which is largely caused by these greenhouse gases, just offset a little bit by the emissions of precursors of sulfate particles that cool the planet, that's from burning coal. Then the scientific and technological narratives about the future of these emissions are also embedded in these plots of the IPCC. This is going forward to the end of the 21st century. With a range of trajectories, imagined futures, imagined net zero points. That's another kind of poetic expression of a very crucial thing, is when is the moment happening that the total emissions on the planet are crossing the zero line and then start to become negative emissions to possibly keep warming below 1.5 degrees. I'm not going to make any final predictions on that one. It's very uncertain, and it's not completely impossible, but it will be really, really hard. Now, increasing attention now needs to be paid to the challenge of adapting to climate change. Right? We've already hit 1 degree. We are progressing towards 2 degrees. Right? So the frame of adaptation is becoming more and more important. And in the Netherlands, we're lucky to have a Delta program, a Delta commissioner. We have a dedicated law. We spend billions of euros, dedicated earmarked funding to prepare the country for what's coming in the next century and beyond. right? And also that includes large-scale singular events, rapid acceleration and melting of the Antarctic ice sheet. We are now focusing on a slowdown or stopping of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, which will bring cooling. It's so weird, right? So we are now looking at new scenarios where there will actually be in the UK and the Netherlands, there will be a cooling coming on top of the warming. So getting more warm at the tropics, and then we'll be cooling here and getting drier. The whole thing is messed up. And it's getting more and more likely that it may happen. But there's wisdom to try to avoid the worst, and there's wisdom in trying to really... Adaptation is nice, but the more you mitigate, reduce the emissions, the least the risk you will have of not being able to adapt. And there's this kind of graph of the reasons for concern that are each time included in the IPCC. They call it the burning embers diagrams. And in the last cycle, they have had to increase the risk. So at lower temperatures, we already think that there's high risks to unique and threatened systems. So the coral reefs dying, right? But also the large-scale singular events, these colors keep getting darker each round by new discoveries that there is a larger sensitivity to what's happening. So what are these technologies then that we think that we need? And there's an approach here from Princeton with these wedges. You can't read it, but there's a whole suite of different technologies out there. And it seems we need them all, right? And just one of those wedges is a doubling of nuclear energy. And it is not even doing the trick. But if you don't do it, you lose a wedge. So you have this kind of question all the time. Do we say we cannot use technology A, B, or C? The longer that list becomes, the least options we have to mitigate the problem. And let me get to the end on some things on the IPCC. So one forum that has to decide how you represent the science then to decision makers is the IPCC. I will show a few pictures that demonstrate some of the working of this panel, which is all about language drafting, right? And here's one from the back of the room. This was in Paris in 2007. In the front, you have the authors. They sit there at the front and they sit at the podium as well. And in the middle, you have the different countries of the UN, ordered alphabetically, which is the reason that the Netherlands and New Zealand are always collaborating in the UN, because we sit next to each other, and we're also small countries, and we have large, etc. But yeah, Netherlands and New Zealand has been a partner in all these negotiations because of the alphabet. And then in the back of the room, you have all these different actors that represent or claim to represent different interests. So you have the coal lobby, the oil lobby, Greenpeace. They're all running around. Right? They don't have a right to speak and change the text, but you can see the moment, okay, they want to change something, someone's running to Saudi Arabia to get an intervention, or the Greenpeace person is running to the German delegation to raise their flag and to change the sentence. So that's a really interesting dynamic. But the way this meeting proceeds is sentence by sentence. So a sentence is highlighted on the screen. The last changes in response to the last round of government review, typically 100 pages of government comments, which have come after 2 rounds of first expert review and then expert and government review. So this is a very elaborate process. And then the author sitting on the podium explain the latest changes they made and then track changes. Sentence is highlighted and the question is asked, is there any country in the world that has an objection to this sentence? Right? And you have to get through dozens of pages to conclude this summary for policymakers, which each time has succeeded. Either you have 4 days, you do it in 4 days, and a night or another night. So 48 hours in a row is typically what you do at the end. That happens with UN meetings nowadays. Or you do it online, like we did with the last report, Working Group 1, where all the working groups had to be done online. So we had a 2-week period in different time zones in a continuous process to negotiate. So I really thoroughly enjoyed my role. Now, after the philosophy observer role in 2001. I joined the government in 2001 and I became a representative to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, also responsible for looking into all the errors that they had made in one of the reports and being the rapporteur for reform in quality assurance improvements in the IPCC. This was Stockholm, 2013. And the beauty in a sense was that I really found ways, which I was really happy with, to be a diplomat, between oil exporting countries and risk-averse countries, so Saudi Arabia and Germany in a sense, with the science and the language to look through, okay, what are the uncertainties, what are the things that they want to have, what do the chapters allow for, and finding new ways to formulate sentences that then lead to consensus. And sometimes the Netherlands was even asked to co-chair a contact group, so if a sentence gets stuck in the plenary and takes too long, here you see me co-chair with India on a particular part in the Working Group 2 report, which is on the adaptation to climate change. Now, just how does religion get represented in the IPCC? I have 2 slides on that. So one is, yeah, they have the word values, sociocultural factors, social barriers, that's where religion kind of features. And they have a whole set of sentences in their Working Group 3 report about religion, where they say, well, yeah, religion can help. We need to reduce our emissions. Yeah, religion can help there. They can help formulate cultural interpretations. So I'm getting to my poetics. Be a cultural resource. Provide leverage points for inner transformation toward sustainability. And of course, you would need specific religious poetics to do that. And I think you can't derive that from science engineering. So there's an openness to other sources of language and poetics to talk about climate change here. They talk about religious symbols and metaphors that have to feed into popular movements for climate action. I think there's work to be done here, but let me reach a conclusion, which is those 2 examples I mentioned at the start. So, before I wrap up, I really would like to flag that Western modern poetics, as also flagged then in the IPCC that we should try to formulate, they may not be the same as non-modern poetics. There are different worldviews, different poetics in different cultures out there, and we shouldn't assume a seamless integration. The first example, analyzed in my book, is what happened when a country delegation in the IPCC, they did it twice in working group, so in the adaptation and mitigation report, they emphatically asked the authors to include Mother Earth in the report. Where is Mother Earth in the report? And had a very good political explanation there as well, which I'm happy to explain too. But of course, I witnessed that happening. This was in Yokohama in 2014, and the authors were like deer staring in headlights. What? Where's Mother Earth in the report? And they could have found ways, I think, even better than what they did, because this is a kind of bloodless text, did not really include Mother Earth. It only instrumentally reflected a potential instrumental use of indigenous knowledge. I think this is very problematic. And they could have made reference to the legal texts that are out there about, there's a constitution in Latin America and some laws on Mother Earth and how that could play a role also in how you address climate change. I'm not saying that I know how to do it better, but I just flag here, I saw in that instance there was this fundamental incommensurability between Western science and non-modern worldviews, which beautifully played out, documented that they had no idea how to deal with that intervention. Second one, I'm not going to show the video because maybe if there's a question about it, but this is about the monkey cheeks. I was fascinated by this. This is comparing Thailand to the Netherlands in terms of water management, especially comparing Thailand to Myanmar, Vietnam and Bangladesh, because all the other countries were very happy to take our advice on how you do delta plans. You look into the far future, you make scenarios, you run models, and then you plan how you deal with the climate change in the future. And the Thai didn't want it. They didn't want it for free, they just didn't want it. So we went there, actually postdocs went there to do interviews. Why don't you like our approach? And we had a bold hypothesis, and well, it got published, so it must be right, but we claimed that this was due to a Buddhist model of kingship. Thailand has never been colonized. And fundamentally, this worldview, a Buddhist worldview, had this strong influence against this Protestant idea that we can plan our way towards progress. So, yeah, we really analyzed this approach that they had. And one of them was Monkey Cheeks, which was the king of Thailand, was also trained as an engineer. And he planned water projects. And he had the analogy with monkeys that put bananas in their cheeks and don't immediately eat them, but they have them in their cheeks. We can do that with water too. And so this whole imagery of monkey cheeks Maybe we will look at the video if you want to see it. But it's such an interesting portrayal of a fundamentally different way. And I'm not saying they're not westernized, and I'm not saying they're not using modern technology. But there's this layer in the imagery that they use to make decisions that is really different and really interesting. So to conclude. I have some doubts whether we will usefully derive new poetics from science, engineering, or secular theories of Gaia. That's based on a scientific idea from James Lovelock, which could then create modern myths that could then stir and be strong enough to motivate people to act and avert the ecological crisis. However, I also think it doesn't help to blame science for a religious disenchantment of nature, since such an accusation is based on an incorrect image of what science is. And also having an awareness of this is Lisa Sideris' target, having an awareness of our cosmic history, the marvelous biosphere that's a result of evolution, it can inspire and it can really talk about value and reasons to act. It's not nothing. And that's kind of where I would like to end, in a sense, by leaving this open on the table. I don't have the answer from my side, not a final answer. It was never my intention either. But I hope that you have each found something interesting in this lecture. I'm very happy to respond to your questions and show the video if you want to. So thank you very much for your attention.
His Majesty is an extremely perceptive observer of nature, and he is highly skilled in adopting his observations to develop new ideas and solve many problems. On the 14th of November, during the heavy floods throughout the country, His Majesty advised those concerned in solving the problem that the Monkey Cheeks project provides a solution to the flooding problem in the Bangkok metropolis. His Majesty elaborated that if we hand a banana to a monkey, it will quickly peel the banana and eat it. It then stores the banana in its cheeks, which has the capacity to hold a whole bunch of bananas. The monkey will slowly chew and swallow the bits of banana when it wants to. The example of storing the bananas in the cheeks is an example of how we should drain the stagnant flooded waters on the east and west of the Chao Phraya River. The Monkey Cheeks project is a water organization system for the flooding season to prevent as well as reduce flooding in the lower Chao Phraya River by draining the waterways such as ditches and canals into small reservoirs. This is similar to the monkey holding the banana bits in its cheeks. Water is drained into the sea when the seawater level reduces. The Monkey Cheeks project is...
But I was just fascinated by that, so I wanted to share that.
Thank you very much, Arthur.
Yeah.
And as I say, you can either stand or sit.
I will stand. I can
Very
see
good.
the people.
And so we have lots of time for questions. Who would like to be first? Tobias.
Thank you very much. Sorry, a bit of a cheeky question, but given all of your background in politics as well as the science and the theology, I was very interested in your Cli-Fi reading group. What are your top recommendations for climate fiction?
So, the standard answer would be, and we have read that and you should do that, is Ministry of the Future, right? I don't know if that's already on the list. But Love in the Anthropocene is a really interesting one by environmental ethicist Dale Jamieson and Bonnie Natsam. And I brought those. I organized a conference at Star Island for the international, no, not the international, the Institute on Religion in an Age of Science, IRIS, a few years back on the role of religion in climate change. And we had the author there, as well as Eleftheria is another novel that I can recommend. And we have a paper in that. It's a Zygon issue, the March 2024 issue, the first one, published with the new publishers. I recommend you go to Zygon, March 2024 issue, which is on climate, and there's a really interesting chapter on climate fiction by Eric Orts, which I can highly recommend. So that would be my top 3 then, right? Yeah. No, top 4. Now top 3.
And who's next? Yes, Tim.
Yeah, thank you so much, Arthur. This is potentially a slightly poorly formed question, but I'm thinking a little bit about the tensions between the global and the local, and particularly when we're talking about a form of myth-making that is going to be motivating, right? So, as I understand Latour and others, there's a bit of reticence about, so his concern with the concept of the global, right? As it risks a kind of totalitarianism. Any myth-making on the global scale risks kind of being top-down. And that's potentially a criticism that you could level at kind of the universe story, the kind of Thomas Berry stuff, appealing to science as this uniting myth that's going to inspire everybody to kind of join this project. And so in a sense, I sort of take away from that you need to turn to a much more localized form of myth-making in order to motivate people. And yet it always remains the case that climate change is a global phenomenon, right? And it's a global issue that we have to deal with that's affecting an entire planetary system. I'm just wondering if you have any kind of thoughts or insights as to how we
Well, I echo Latour's warning of not...
Yeah.
He's very critical, for instance, of this imagery of the globe.
Yeah.
And I think rightfully so. So it's so easy to project or to have this kind of, we think we have the overarching view of the cosmos, of the Earth, of the biosphere. And yeah, I think he really opens up, and I don't think he has done it enough, so I'm now also really reading a lot of feminist criticism of Latour's work, including also black feminists, and I had this example of a billion black Anthropocenes or none, and there you get the raw stories of, this Anthropocene, the flip side of how that was created was on the back of the slave trade, and really looking at that very kind of that more situated lens in terms of what are the contexts that different people have been living in, and how does that help in formulating ideas for going forward. And it was very hard to get any positive message from that book by Catherine Yourself. We were trying this week. We actually had it in a reading group as well on the Anthropocene. But yeah, you have to keep confronting yourself with those raw other voices in terms of, don't think that you can come up with anything universal that's larger than just your powerful circle, in a sense, and that's a good reflection for people who live in the West and are privileged. So, no answer.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much for the talk. I thought it was really fascinating, the discussion of poetics and how it's related to all these different areas. I've read a philosopher who describes how allegory and myth are preparatory for for metaphysics, and an example would be in Greek culture, where there's evolution of Greek language from and poetry is the early language, and then there's drama and tragedy, and so then you have philosophers like Plato and Socrates. And you mentioned that there was room for metaphysics. So I just, what you were saying, I just wondered if you had any more thoughts on the place for metaphysics, where this might lead.
So two things. So first of all, metaphysics has been there forever, and has always also developed also in conjunction with science and religion in a way. And I think that what you described there can be generalized towards the need for first have kind of myth before you have scientific concepts. And same for kind of if you want to philosophize in religion. So it's never has gone away, and we cannot do without. And even the kind of very stern German philosophy that I propose, right, that limits itself, like Kant, to we don't go into metaphysics, has a metaphysical presupposition itself, and then self-reflexively realizes that. So, having said all that, so the question that got posed in a sense, can metaphysics be scientific?
I think you can distinguish between...
Can metaphysics be part of academia, because the person who felt, when reading my book, that they were left out, was concluding that I was saying you're not part of academia or not part of Wissenschaft, and that's kind of what Riekert is implying, and over time I'm backtracking a little bit. So yeah, I think metaphysics and kind of the philosophical work that's done there can be done in a disciplined way, and in that sense can be fully part of our academic life. So I've become more open to that. I don't know if that was exactly your question in terms of the academic status of metaphysics, but I think it's I've always found it fascinating and interesting. But it will always but you make an assumption. You make an assumption. Yeah, of course you make assumptions, but you can still follow through rigorously what are the consequences of making different assumptions, and that's, I think, a really interesting practice.
Thank you.
Rebecca.
Yes, thank you so much for that talk. This might be part of what Tim was saying, or at least leading on from it, which is I'm just wondering what the motivation, either in Latour or in your own opinion, is for adopting or propounding the development of this new civic cult of Gaia. I'm thinking about how, once people feel that it's relevant, that climate change is something that they should care about, I can see reasons for it. But kind of offering reasons won't necessarily motivate people to care about it in the first place and adopt those reasons. And, I think often people are not motivated because either they don't believe that it's happening or because they think that we can't do anything about it. And often that framing, and maybe this is the relationship between the local and the global, is, people don't see themselves as not caring for the climate. They see themselves as caring for their family, or not adopting a Protestant framework, as the example you were giving, or trusting in God, or, often they see themselves as doing something positive that has nothing to do with climate change, but maybe it's a correlative concept. So I'm just wondering, maybe connected to that, if, first of all, how you think Poetics can help, or whether the tour says anything about that. And if maybe you have any practical examples from your work with the Dutch government or elsewise where this framework of transcendental naturalism that you propose helped navigate that specific difficulty in a kind of practical way.
Let me start with the last one. So I used this framework. I was asked by the Prime Minister's Science Advice Council to write a working paper on climate change. How does it develop after 2050, and how do societies respond to it after 2050, and how should the interface between science and politics look like after 2050, and what is the contents of science and the uncertainties after 2050. I should never have said yes to that. I thought I will do a literature study and I will find what people know. No. So I had to make it up. But one of the ways I made it up was by using Latour's kind of broad framework in terms of his modes of existence to look at all these different dimensions of climate change, which means the legal side. How is that going to develop? And you have a lot of the Netherlands, a lot of civil law, and there's administrative law, but there's also climate fiction. You have Nuremberg trials, right? So you have people who are, I don't know, they get the death penalty or get imprisoned for having been a CEO of a fossil fuel company. Yeah? So that's a really interesting branch of how are things developing on, just on the legal side. I'm just interested in that one. But also for all the other dimensions, I kind of went through how in the far future things may change and develop, how we organize ourselves, how, and then we come to the bottom one, which also have the bottom one in that one. I explicitly included in that document for the government religion, right? And the different views people may have with respect to nature, their role in the climate system and how that changes over time, and then what the religious imagery there is. If I get to what's the best religious imagery, it's the encyclical by the late Pope, right? It's an astonishing document, this Laudato Si, in terms of and you can see there's problems there, but it's raw politics in a sense. It's very much focused on turning things upside down, but also the imagery that he's using, focusing on the poetics. I find that's really beautiful, and that may well motivate some people. So there are some examples where I think, hey, there's a beautiful intervention made. And that encyclical was one of the best portrayals of the state of the science as well, right? So that was it was a team, right? And it was just pretty well done. I don't know if it answers your question. I'm just rambling.
Thank you.
And yes, Mark.
Thank you, Arthur. And I'm so sorry I missed the first half of your talk, so you may well already have addressed what I'm about to ask, but it, excuse me, it relates to your last point about Laudato Si. I was wondering, so there's another fairly large cluster of scholars, I mean, it's difficult to quite know what, eco-theologians, in other words, who equally react to the issue about the religious disenchantment of nature, but by and large tend to call on fairly traditional religious resources to answer it. And of course, Laudato Si is an example of such a document that tries to do that. So, my reading of Bruno Latour is he does a lot of theology, but doesn't really call upon eco-theology. And I wondered how you situate yourself with relation to the eco-theology program.
So I must admit I've only read a few eco-theological works, and I found them hugely inspiring, but I haven't really professionally dealt with them. The gap that I analyze in Latour could easily be filled by approaches from eco-theology, in terms of what's missing from trying to bring things from the science. You have to draw on other sources, and yes, those sources include traditional sources, very much so. So, it's a good trigger, maybe to explore this explicitly as a response to what I see is missing in Latour, because I then want to critically analyze from my transcendental naturalist perspective what are the assumptions that the eco-theologians are making. But I still think that maybe I will have some philosophical issues. The theological sources they draw on may be very valid. So thanks for triggering that. I'm thinking of a next big grand plan, and this could maybe. Let me see. Thanks for the suggestion. I mean, I have a DPhil in theology formally, but I never did any theology in my life. Don't tell anyone. This is the faculty of theology and religion, right? And religion. So I'm fine. Yeah, but it's the science and religion program, as you know, is part of the theology DPhil. But maybe after having a doctorate in theology, I should do some theology after.
And we have time for one more. Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Arthur. This is really interesting. I'm curious on the poetics, law, and politics angle in a particular case. You may have nothing to say or a lot to say on this. The assigning of legal personhood to non-human entities like rivers and in mountains. I know that that's happening in New Zealand. It was in Brazil recently. It was a river that got assigned legal personhood. Could you just talk about that, like in terms of the framework you're representing here?
Yeah, it's very much in line with things that this kind of way of thinking allows, as I would say, experiments also, in a way. Like, I have the pragmatic question. I have discussions with my wife a lot about this. She's a judge and she doesn't like any of that. Like, yeah, but we have other laws. You can protect the river. Why do you need to appoint somebody then as a guardian for the river? Because it is a why? And I think the beauty of it is the poetics and the imagery and the acknowledgement of, in a particular way, in a legal way, to give legal standing to that entity. So that's not necessarily just reduced to another kind of law that we can easily change, that we need to protect nature, right? So I'm very, very open to those approaches. I'm also very skeptical about the actual effect, whether the protection improves if you give legal person status to a river. But again, New Zealand is nearby in terms of our discussions, as you know. So it's a really interesting thing to find out how it helps. I think a way in which it helps, and that's why in the end I think it's a very good idea to do it, is it forces you in a particular approach to deal with the local population, right? The indigenous population. And that relates to how I talk about Mother Earth, which has a legal framework for how a human ecosystem whole, in a sense, should be treated as such, and that then requires, and again, it was not effective. There is more mining. The idea was it would reduce mining. There's more mining, so it doesn't work somehow, having a law on Mother Earth, which is really sad, because the idea should be it should give more protection. But it does give the sensitivity to the fundamental incommensurability between Western approaches to law, Western approaches to science, and indigenous life worlds. And I think that's a benefit of using these kind of other tools. But yeah, again, so I don't give any answers really. So it's really interesting. It's happening, and people are naive about how effective it will be.
Very good. Let's say thank you to Arthur Petersen. Thank you very much.